The package arrived on a dreary Thursday afternoon. Claire was at her kitchen table, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee and staring blankly out the window as rain tapped rhythmically against the glass. The last thing she expected that day was a delivery, let alone a package with her name scrawled across it in a neat, unfamiliar script. The box was small, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a faded piece of twine that looked as though it had been reused for years. Claire tilted her head, trying to recall if she'd ordered anything recently, but nothing came to mind. Curiosity got the better of her. She set her coffee down, grabbed a pair of scissors, and carefully cut through the twine. The box was old, its corners soft and fraying, and when she peeled back the paper, the faint scent of dust and cedar filled the air. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellowed tissue paper, was a doll. It was unlike any doll Claire had ever seen. Its porcelain face was meticulously painted, with rosy cheeks and faintly pursed lips. The eyes were made of glass, a striking shade of blue that seemed almost alive. They shimmered even in the dim light of the kitchen, catching and reflecting every shadow. The doll's hair was golden, curled into ringlets that framed its delicate features, and it wore a lace dress that had yellowed with age. Tiny leather boots completed the ensemble, scuffed at the toes as though they'd seen many years of play. Claire's first reaction was to smile. The craftsmanship was undeniable, a true antique, but as she lifted the doll out of the box, she felt an unexpected chill run through her. The doll was heavier than she anticipated, its cool porcelain sending a shiver up her spine. She held it at arm's length, examining the intricate details, and then noticed something tucked beneath the tissue paper at the bottom of the box. A note? The paper was thin and brittle, the ink smudged in places, but the message was clear. To my dearest Claire, this belonged to your great-aunt Margaret. She always believed it was special, a treasure to be passed down. Please take care of it. Love, Aunt Ruth. Claire frowned. She hadn't seen or spoken to Aunt Ruth in years. Ruth had been the black sheep of the family, eccentric and reclusive, and her passing a few weeks ago had barely registered amid Claire's daily grind. Why would Ruth leave her this? And why a doll of all things? It wasn't as though Claire had a penchant for antiques or collectibles. She didn't even like dolls. They always struck her as unnervingly lifelike. She set the doll on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she moved around the room, and every time she glanced back, she half expected its head to have turned. She shook off the thought, laughing softly at her own ridiculousness. "It's just a doll," she muttered, more to herself than to the empty house. But as she went about her afternoon, a nagging sense of unease began to creep in. The first night, Claire placed the doll on a shelf in the living room. It sat propped up between a stack of books and a small potted plant, its hands resting neatly in its lap. Claire tried not to look at it as she settled onto the couch with a glass of wine and a book, but every so often, her eyes would dart toward it, unbidden. It was the eyes, she decided. They were too realistic, too vivid. It felt as though the doll were watching her, silently judging her every move. "Stop it," she whispered, forcing her gaze back to the pages in front of her. The rain continued to fall outside, a steady patter against the windows. The house was otherwise quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Claire tried to lose herself in her book, but her mind kept wandering back to the doll. Around midnight, she gave up and decided to go to bed. As she turned off the living room light, she hesitated, glancing back at the shelf. In the darkness, the doll's silhouette was barely visible, but the glint of its glass eyes caught the faintest sliver of moonlight. Claire shuddered and hurried up the stairs, leaving the room behind. That night, she dreamed of a little girl. The girl was sitting in a vast, empty room, her back turned to Claire. Her hair was golden, curled into perfect ringlets, and she was cradling the doll in her lap. The girl hummed a soft, unfamiliar tune, rocking back and forth. Claire tried to call out to her, but no sound came. Her voice was trapped, strangled by an invisible force. As she stepped closer, the girl suddenly stopped humming. Slowly, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes, those vivid, glassy blue eyes, shone brightly in the darkness. Claire woke with a start, her heart racing. The clock on her nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. She sat up in bed, straining to listen, but heard nothing. Still, the unease lingered, wrapping around her like a cold blanket. She told herself it was just a bad dream, a product of her overactive imagination. But as she lay back down and closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the image of those eyes staring back at her. The next morning, Claire tried to shake off the lingering effects of the nightmare. She busied herself with chores, errands, anything to keep her mind occupied. She avoided the living room as much as possible, only venturing in to grab her phone or a cup of coffee. Every time she entered, she could feel the doll's presence, as though it were aware of her avoidance. By midday, she decided she was being ridiculous. It was just a doll, an inanimate object. She'd let her imagination get the better of her, that's all. Determined to prove this to herself, she marched into the living room and stood in front of the shelf, arms crossed. "You're just a doll," she said aloud, her voice firm. The doll, of course, didn't respond, but as Claire stared into its eyes, she felt a strange, inexplicable urge to reach out and touch it. Her hand hovered in the air for a moment before she shook her head and pulled back. She grabbed a book from the shelf and left the room, not daring to look back. That evening, the strange occurrences began. It started small, the sound of footsteps creaking across the floorboards downstairs when she was upstairs brushing her teeth. The faint scent of lavender, though she hadn't used lavender-scented anything in months. A soft, almost imperceptible giggle that seemed to echo just at the edge of her hearing. Claire dismissed each incident as her imagination. The house was old. Creaking floorboards were to be expected. The lavender could have been a lingering scent from an old candle. And the giggle? Probably just the wind, carrying some distant sound from outside. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard something that couldn't be so easily explained. It was the sound of movement, a soft shuffling, like fabric brushing against wood. It came from downstairs, faint but unmistakable. Claire's heart began to pound. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling. But as the noise continued, growing louder and more deliberate, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She grabbed her phone and crept to the top of the stairs, her breath shallow. Peering down into the darkness, she strained her eyes, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The living room was quiet, the shadows still. And yet, the sound persisted, coming from somewhere near the shelf. Claire's stomach twisted. Slowly, she descended the stairs, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. She reached the living room and froze. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting upright on the coffee table, its glass eyes glinting in the dim light. The doll sat silently on the mantel of my fireplace, its delicate porcelain face catching the soft glow of the late afternoon sunlight. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an antique relic, something with a fragile beauty that once belonged to a world far removed from the digital age. But there was something about its eyes, those glassy, hand-painted eyes, that left me uneasy. No matter where I stood, it felt like they followed me. A trick of the light, I told myself, but the sensation lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. I'd picked it up at an estate sale just a few days prior. The elderly woman running the sale had seemed eager to part with it. She'd smiled a little too widely when I handed over the cash, her hands trembling as she wrapped it in crinkled newspaper. "You'll want to take good care of her," she'd said. Her tone was sweet, almost cloying, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Relief? Fear? I couldn't place it at the time, but it stuck with me. The first night the doll was in my home, everything seemed normal. I had set it carefully on the mantel, a temporary spot until I could figure out where to display it properly. I went about my evening routine. A quick dinner, some TV, scrolling aimlessly through social media. By the time I turned in for the night, the doll was the furthest thing from my mind. But as I lay in bed, drifting towards sleep, I thought I heard something. A faint creak, like the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. I froze, holding my breath to listen. My bedroom door was cracked open, and the hallway beyond was dark and silent. Just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses like this make noises at night. I rolled over and pulled the blankets tighter around me, dismissing the sound as nothing. Small signs of something wrong. The next morning, I passed by the mantel on my way to make coffee and paused mid-step. The doll was no longer sitting upright. It had slumped forward slightly, its head tilted down as if in some kind of mournful pose. I frowned. That's weird, I muttered under my breath. Maybe I hadn't set it securely on the mantel. The wood was old, slightly uneven in places. Still, I couldn't shake the small prickle of unease that crept up my spine as I adjusted it back to its original position. Its glassy eyes stared back at me, unblinking, as though daring me to question what I'd seen. That night, as I settled in on the couch to watch a movie, I found myself glancing at the doll more than the screen. It sat there, perfectly still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to focus on the movie, but my attention kept drifting back to it. I could feel its presence in the room, like a weight pressing against my consciousness. It was just a doll, a lifeless object. I knew that, but knowing didn't stop my mind from spiraling into irrational territory. What if it moved when I wasn't looking? What if it wasn't as lifeless as it seemed? I laughed at myself, trying to break the tension. "You're being ridiculous," I said aloud, as if hearing my own voice would ground me. But the sound felt hollow in the empty room, swallowed up by the silence. The first real incident. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, double-checked the locks on the doors, and headed to bed. As I passed the mantel, I glanced at the doll one last time. It was still there, sitting in the exact position I'd left it. Satisfied, I turned off the lights and went upstairs. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the creak of floorboards this time. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently drumming against a wooden surface. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was coming from downstairs. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, turning on the flashlight app. The thin beam of light did little to chase away the shadows as I crept out of bed and into the hallway. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I felt my pulse in my throat as I made my way to the top of the staircase, peering down into the darkness below. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper, shaky and uncertain. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an oppressive silence. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was the old pipes? Or an animal outside? Gathering my courage, I descended the stairs, one step at a time. The beam of my flashlight wavered slightly as my hands trembled. When I reached the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The doll was no longer on the mantel. It was on the coffee table, sitting upright, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were studying me. My breath caught in my chest. I hadn't moved it. I knew I hadn't. There was no logical explanation for how it got there. A cold chill ran down my spine as I approached the coffee table. My fingers hovered over the doll, hesitant to touch it. For a brief moment, I thought about throwing it away, but the idea felt absurd. What would I even tell people? That a doll had moved on its own? They'd think I was losing my mind. Instead, I picked it up and placed it back on the mantel. My hands shook as I positioned it carefully, making sure it was secure this time. Then, without looking back, I turned off the living room lights and hurried back upstairs, locking my bedroom door behind me. A pattern emerges. The following days brought more strange occurrences. Little things at first. I'd find objects in different places than where I'd left them. My keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook by the door. A book from the shelf lying open on the coffee table. Each time, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was distracted and didn't remember moving them. But the doll was harder to explain. Every morning, it seemed to be in a slightly different position. One day, it was turned to face the window. Another day, it was leaning forward, its tiny porcelain hands just barely touching the edge of the mantel. And then there were the nights when I'd hear faint noises, soft creaks, distant whispers, the occasional tapping sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the end of the week, I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong. Whether it was the doll itself, or just my mind playing tricks on me, I didn't know. But I could feel it in my bones. My house no longer felt like a safe haven. It felt like a trap, closing in around me with every passing day. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Throwing the doll away seemed too simple, too easy. And besides, part of me was afraid that it wouldn't work, that whatever was happening would follow me, even without the doll. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I resolved to figure out what was going on. I would find out where the doll came from, who had owned it before, and why it seemed to carry an air of unease wherever it went. I didn't know what I would find, but I had to try. Ignorance was no longer an option. The curiosity surrounding the doll became impossible to ignore. Every time I walked past it, perched quietly in its place, I felt its presence like a living thing. Its porcelain face seemed to shift ever so slightly, an angle of the head that wasn't quite the same, a fleeting glint in its glassy eyes that I swore wasn't there before. The rational part of me wanted to believe I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that this doll didn't belong to me, or to anyone. Its purpose, its history, felt like something that needed to be uncovered. That night, unable to sleep, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Armed with a flashlight and a glass of whiskey for courage, I went into the spare room where the doll sat on the antique chair. Its small, pale hands rested delicately in its lap, and the frills of its dress seemed to glow faintly under the dim light. I set the flashlight down and took a deep breath. "Okay," I muttered under my breath. "Let's figure out who you are." The bottom of the chair creaked as I crouched down to inspect the doll closer. Turning it over carefully, I searched for any markings or tags. There it was, a faint inscription etched into the base of the porcelain neck. Madeline and Company, 1918, I read aloud. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. A quick internet search on my phone revealed that Madeline and Company had been a prominent doll manufacturer in the early 20th century. Their dolls were highly prized collectibles, but they also had a darker legacy. Stories of cursed or haunted dolls manufactured by the company circulated among collectors. Apparently, some believed that the founder, Madeleine Dubois, had a fascination with the occult, and there were rumors that her creations were more than just lifeless toys. One story stood out. It was about a specific line of dolls referred to as the Lost Companions. These dolls were said to be created during a time of personal tragedy for Madeline. After losing her only daughter to illness, she became obsessed with the idea of preserving her essence. Collectors speculated that these dolls carried more than just craftsmanship. They carried a piece of her daughter's soul. I froze, my finger hovering over the screen as I stared at the article. The doll sitting across from me, with its innocent yet piercing gaze, fit the description of the Lost Companions perfectly. I glanced back at it, my chest tightening. Was it possible? Could this doll really have a connection to such a macabre story? Deciding I needed to know more, I kept digging. Late into the night, I found myself scrolling through online forums dedicated to antique dolls and paranormal enthusiasts. One thread in particular caught my eye: the forgotten dolls of Madeline and Company. A user described owning one of these dolls and the strange occurrences that followed. Whispered voices, unexplained cold drafts, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Every detail mirrored my own experiences. But it was one post, buried at the bottom of the thread, that truly made my stomach churn. A user, now deleted, had written, "They're not just dolls. They're waiting. They remember. And if you bring one into your home, it remembers you too." I pushed my chair back from the desk, suddenly feeling exposed. The shadows in the room felt heavier, more oppressive. I glanced at the doll again, still sitting in its chair. Its head seemed to tilt slightly, as if acknowledging my discovery. "No," I whispered to myself. "That's not possible." I decided I needed to find someone who could verify the doll's history. The idea of keeping it in my home, not knowing what it truly was, felt unbearable. Through another late-night search, I found a nearby antique appraiser who specialized in rare and historical dolls. I made an appointment for the following day. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the faintest sound outside my bedroom door. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers lightly brushing against wood. I told myself it was the house settling, but I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I wrapped the doll in a blanket and placed it carefully into a box. I drove to the appraiser's shop, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. The shop was a cluttered, dimly lit space filled with glass cases of trinkets and antiques. The air smelled of old wood and mothballs. The appraiser, a wiry older man named Carl, greeted me with a nod. His gray eyebrows arched slightly when he saw the box I was carrying. "What you got there?" he asked. I carefully unwrapped the doll and placed it on the counter. Carl adjusted his glasses and leaned in for a closer look. "Well, isn't she a beauty?" he murmured. His tone shifted as he examined the markings on the doll's neck. Madeline and Company, 1918. Not many of these left in circulation. "Do you know anything about their history?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Carl glanced at me, his expression curious. "You mean the stories?" "Sure. Most of it's just folklore, but the Lost Companions line, that's a different beast altogether." He paused, his brow furrowing as he turned the doll over in his hands. "This one's in remarkable condition, almost like it's been preserved." Carl fell silent for a moment, then looked at me with a strange intensity. "Where did you get this?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It was a gift," I said finally. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me guess," he said quietly. "Strange things have been happening, haven't they?" I felt my stomach drop. Before I could answer, the bell above the shop door jingled as a gust of wind blew in. The doll, sitting on the counter, tipped slightly to one side as if responding to an unseen force. Carl's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "I've seen enough," he said quickly, his voice tinged with unease. "Take it back. Whatever it is, it's not something I can help you with."
But
"Listen to me," he interrupted, his tone firm. "Some things are better left alone. Get rid of it if you can, but don't bring it back here." The urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. He refused to say anything more, ushering me out of the shop with a look of pity and fear. I returned to my car, the doll still wrapped in its blanket on the passenger seat. The relief I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of foreboding. As I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, I glanced at the doll, its face barely visible beneath the folds of fabric. For a moment, I thought I saw its lips curve into the faintest of smiles. The drive back from Carl's antique shop was unusually quiet. The hum of the tires on the asphalt should have been soothing, but instead, it amplified the tension in the air. I couldn't help glancing at the doll on the passenger seat every few moments, the blanket barely concealing its delicate, porcelain face. I'd wrapped it so carefully, but still, I swore its eyes were peeking through the folds. The words Carl had said kept echoing in my mind. "Get rid of it if you can." That "if" felt like a warning, a caveat that there might not be a way out. But I didn't know how to get rid of something like this. Could I just toss it in a dumpster? Burn it? Both options seemed absurd, but keeping it wasn't an option either. The unease had become unbearable. Halfway home, I passed a stretch of forest lining the highway, its shadows twisting in the fading sunlight. An idea struck me. I could leave the doll here. Just pull over, place it at the base of a tree, and drive away. Surely, out in the wilderness, it couldn't find its way back. I took the next exit and found a narrow dirt road leading into the woods. The car bumped along the uneven path until I reached a small clearing. The air was cold, sharper than it should have been for early fall. Leaves rustled in the trees above, but the sound seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I grabbed the doll, still swaddled in the blanket, and stepped out of the car. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked toward the tree line. The farther I got from the car, the heavier the doll seemed to become, as if it were resisting me. "This is it," I whispered to myself. "You're staying here." I set it down against the base of a large oak tree and unwrapped it just enough to reveal its face. For a moment, I froze. Its expression looked different, subtly, but unmistakably. The corners of its mouth seemed to curl upward in the faintest suggestion of a smirk. My pulse quickened as I stepped back, resisting the urge to run. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle. I spun around, scanning the woods, but there was nothing. No one. Just the doll, sitting there with its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. I didn't wait for a second sound. I bolted back to the car, my breath coming in short gasps. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the clearing, back toward the highway. By the time I made it home, the sun had fully set, casting my neighborhood in shadows. I felt a small sense of relief pulling into the driveway, like I'd finally left something terrible behind. The house was quiet and still, welcoming me back with its usual sense of familiarity. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I decided to make myself a drink and unwind. Something strong, bourbon, neat. As I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, I tried to convince myself that everything was over. The doll was gone, left in the woods where it belonged. Whatever strange energy it carried was no longer my problem. But then, a faint sound broke the silence. A soft tap, tap, tap against the living room window. My stomach dropped. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something small pressed against the glass. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." I approached the window slowly, every step feeling like an eternity. With trembling hands, I pulled the curtain aside. There it was, the doll. Its porcelain face was illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light, its eyes fixed on me. It was propped upright against the window pane, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. My knees went weak, and I stumbled back. This wasn't possible. I'd left it miles away, deep in the forest. There was no way it could be here. Desperate, I yanked open the front door and stepped outside, but the porch was empty. The doll was gone. Only the faint rustle of the wind and the distant hum of traffic broke the silence. I turned back toward the door, and that's when I saw it again. Sitting on the coffee table inside the house, exactly where I'd set my drink minutes earlier. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of, Carl, the appraiser. His number was still in my recent calls, and I hit dial with shaking hands. It rang several times before his voice finally answered. "Hello?" he said, his tone wary. "It's me," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "The doll. It came back. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end. "I told you to get rid of it," Carl said finally, his voice low. "I did. I left it in the woods, miles from here, but it's back. It's in my house." Another pause. "Then it's already chosen you," he said quietly. "You can't just abandon it. It won't let you." What does that even mean? I snapped, my frustration bubbling over. "What do I do?" "You have to figure that out for yourself," Carl said, his voice heavy with regret. "But let me give you one piece of advice. Don't make it angry." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The rest of the night was a blur. I locked every door and window, turned on every light in the house, and stayed as far away from the doll as possible. It sat there on the coffee table, unmoving, its vacant eyes watching me no matter where I went. I considered smashing it, but Carl's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't make it angry." When I finally couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart raced as I bolted upright, scanning the room. The doll was there, sitting on the floor just inside the doorway. And this time, it was smiling. I stared at the doll sitting in the doorway, its porcelain face illuminated by the soft moonlight streaming through the window. The corners of its mouth were curved upward in a faint, mocking smile, as though it knew something I didn't. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to comprehend how it had moved, how it had gotten inside my locked bedroom. A knot of fear coiled tightly in my stomach, but I forced myself to act. Reaching for my phone on the nightstand, I shone the flashlight at the doll. The beam lit up its glassy eyes, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw them flicker. I shook my head, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. "Okay," I whispered under my breath, trying to steady my voice. "You're just a stupid doll. That's all you are." The words felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself more than anything. I grabbed a blanket and edged my way off the bed, keeping as much distance as possible between myself and the thing in the doorway. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I had to get rid of it. This time, for good. I wrapped the doll tightly in the blanket, refusing to look at its face. Its porcelain body felt heavier than it should have, almost as if it were resisting me. I didn't care. I carried it out of the room, down the stairs, and straight to the garage. My hands were shaking as I opened the trunk of my car and tossed the bundle inside. Slamming the trunk shut, I leaned against the car, my heart pounding. This wasn't enough. I needed to get it as far away from me as possible, and I needed to do it now. It didn't matter that it was 3 a.m. or that I was running on fumes. I couldn't let that thing stay in my house. The roads were eerily empty as I drove toward the edge of town. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the asphalt, and every now and then, I caught myself glancing in the rearview mirror. The blanket-wrapped doll sat motionless in the trunk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me somehow. I didn't have a plan. I just drove, heading toward a stretch of wilderness outside the city limits. It wasn't until I reached an old bridge over a shallow creek that I finally pulled over. The air was crisp and cold as I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound in the stillness of the night. I opened the trunk and pulled the bundle out. For a moment, I hesitated, clutching the doll wrapped in the blanket. Something about the silence around me felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. "This ends here," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the rush of the creek below. I climbed over the railing of the bridge and stared down at the water. The current wasn't strong, but it was deep enough to carry the doll far away from here. Without another moment's hesitation, I tossed the bundle into the creek. It hit the water with a dull splash and disappeared beneath the surface. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. It was done. The doll was gone. Whatever strange hold it had on me was broken. I stood there for a long time, staring down at the rippling water, half expecting the blanket to resurface. But it didn't. By the time I got back home, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but for the first time in days, I felt like I could finally sleep. I stumbled upstairs to my bedroom, barely bothering to pull off my shoes before collapsing onto the bed. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. My dreams were fragmented and strange. Faint whispers in the darkness, flashes of the doll's face, and that unnerving smile etched into its features. I woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of the dream lingering like a shadow at the edge of my mind. But the day passed uneventfully. I busied myself with chores, trying to distract myself from the events of the night before. I told myself it was over, that the doll was gone for good, and for a while, I believed it. Until the knocking started. It was late evening, and I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a movie. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the TV. Then came the sound, soft at first, barely noticeable. A light, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the front door. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. My first thought was that it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured. It came again, 3 knocks, then silence. My stomach twisted into knots as I stood up, every nerve in my body on edge. I approached the door slowly, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty, the street beyond quiet and still. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find the doll sitting there. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. I shut the door and locked it, my hands trembling. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the stress of the past few days was finally catching up to me. But as I turned to head back to the couch, I stopped in my tracks. The doll was there, sitting in the middle of the living room floor, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if studying me. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, and that same faint, mocking smile was etched across its face. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. This wasn't possible. I'd thrown it into the creek. I'd watched it sink beneath the water. And yet, here it was, as if it had never left. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, every rational thought drowned out by a wave of pure, unrelenting terror. The doll didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just sat there, watching, waiting. And then, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness, and in that moment, I swore I heard it. The faintest sound of laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the silence. The laughter dissolved into silence as the darkness swallowed the room. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the couch, my breath shallow and erratic. The shadows seemed thicker now, pressing in from every corner, suffocating and alive. My rational mind fought to take control, whispering that this was just a bad dream, some residual anxiety or paranoia. But the weight of the doll's presence in the room crushed that hope into dust. The lights flickered back to life. My eyes darted to the spot where the doll had been. It was gone. My stomach dropped like a stone, and a wave of nausea swept over me. I spun in place, scanning the room, but it was empty. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I took a shaky step forward, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It's just my mind playing tricks." But as I turned toward the hallway, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There it was. The doll sat at the base of the staircase, its head tilted to the side, as if it were inviting me to follow. My hands clenched into fists, and I forced myself to breathe. I wasn't going to let it get to me. This was just some elaborate prank, or worse, a sign that my mind was unraveling. "I'm not afraid of you," I said aloud, though the tremor in my voice betrayed the lie. The doll didn't move. Its porcelain face was an emotionless mask, but the longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to change. The faint smile on its lips stretched wider, and its glassy eyes seemed to bore into me, pulling me into their depths. I blinked and looked away, shaking my head as if to clear it. This was ridiculous. It was just a doll, an inanimate object. I couldn't let it have this power over me. I grabbed a towel from the kitchen, wrapped it around the doll, and carried it back to the garage. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a hammer and smashed it down on the bundle, over and over, until the porcelain cracked and shattered beneath the cloth. Each strike sent shards flying, and with each blow, a strange sense of satisfaction surged through me. When I finally stopped, I was gasping for air, sweat dripping down my face. I unwrapped the towel and stared at the remains. The doll's face was split down the middle, one glassy eye dangling from its socket, and its body was a mangled mess of fabric and broken porcelain. "It's over," I whispered, dropping the hammer onto the concrete floor. But as I turned to leave the garage, I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. My blood turned to ice, and I spun around, scanning the room. The shattered remains of the doll were still there, motionless and lifeless. But the sound continued, growing louder, closer. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs. The scraping seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls. And then, it stopped. Silence. I took a hesitant step forward, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the far wall, just outside the garage window. It was fleeting, there and gone in an instant, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hammer. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, just the heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me like a weight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent my nerves into overdrive. I sat on the couch with the hammer clutched tightly in my hands, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner of the room. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I was a wreck, exhausted, paranoid, and teetering on the edge of sanity. But I told myself it was over. Whatever had happened last night, it was done. The doll was destroyed. It couldn't hurt me anymore. Or so I thought. The day passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see the doll sitting there, its head tilted, its eyes boring into me. By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge. The house felt different, heavier somehow, as if the air itself was conspiring against me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house into shadow, I heard it again. The faint, rhythmic tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty halls. I gripped the hammer tightly and crept toward the source of the sound, my breath catching in my throat with every step. The tapping led me to the basement door. It stood ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. The sound was coming from the other side, steady and deliberate, like a metronome counting down the seconds. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run, to leave the house and never look back. But something compelled me forward, a force I couldn't explain, couldn't resist. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from the darkness beyond the door, came a voice. A child's voice, soft and sing-song, carrying a note of eerie familiarity. "Come play with me." The voice sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it was clear enough to freeze me in place. "Come play with me," it repeated, the sing-song tone dancing mockingly in the silence. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it, but it felt as though I had no choice. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, an invisible force pulling me toward the darkness. I tightened my grip on the hammer and slowly pushed the door open. The basement loomed before me, a gaping maw of shadow that swallowed the weak light spilling in from the hallway. The faint scent of mildew wafted up from the depths, mingling with the metallic tang of my own fear. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, each one amplifying the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I reached the bottom, and my flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. The basement was cluttered with the detritus of forgotten years, cardboard boxes, old furniture, a broken lamp. But nothing seemed out of place. The air was still, heavy, almost oppressive. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, the doll sat upright. Its shattered face had somehow reassembled itself, though cracks ran like spiderwebs across its porcelain skin. One of its glass eyes dangled by a thread, swaying gently as if moved by an unseen breeze. My stomach twisted into a knot. I knew I'd destroyed it. I'd felt the porcelain break beneath the hammer, had seen its mangled remains with my own eyes. But here it was, as if mocking me. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The doll didn't answer. Of course it didn't. It was just a doll. An object. An inanimate thing. But the longer I stared at it, the more alive it seemed. The cracks on its face looked like veins, pulsing faintly with a sickly red glow. Its lips, frozen in that faint, eerie smile, seemed to twitch ever so slightly. I stepped closer, gripping the hammer like a lifeline. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, the doll was no longer sitting. It was standing. Its small, delicate hands hung limply at its sides, but its head was tilted upward, those cracked, lifeless eyes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. It hadn't moved. It couldn't have moved. And yet, it was standing. The voice returned, this time louder, echoing off the basement walls. "Come play with me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. The doll didn't move, but the room felt as though it were closing in, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. The voice grew louder, more insistent, overlapping with itself until it became a cacophony of eerie, childlike laughter. "Stop it!" I screamed, raising the hammer. "Just stop." The laughter stopped instantly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. My chest heaved as I stared at the doll, my knuckles white around the hammer's handle. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though the quaver in my voice betrayed the lie. The doll's head tilted further, almost as if it were amused. And then, in one fluid motion, it took a step toward me. That was it. The fragile thread of my courage snapped. I turned and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The laughter started again, echoing behind me, chasing me up the steps. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt into place. The laughter stopped. I stood there, leaning against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of something unseen. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting the doll to be standing there, waiting for me. But it wasn't. The house was empty, eerily still. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I'd escaped. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the other side of the door. Tap, tap, tap. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a pounding. The door rattled in its frame, the hinges groaning under the strain. And then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The seconds stretched into minutes, and still, nothing happened. Slowly, I crept forward, pressing my ear against the door. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence. I exhaled shakily and reached for the deadbolt. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it, but I managed to slide it open. I held my breath and pulled the door open, inch by inch. The basement was empty. The doll was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every shadow set my nerves on edge. I sat on the couch with the hammer in my lap, my eyes fixed on the basement door. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened last night was just some twisted hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. As the morning light streamed through the windows, I made a decision. I wasn't staying in this house another night. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, determined to leave this nightmare behind. But as I stepped outside, I froze. Sitting on the front porch, its cracked face turned toward me, was the doll. It wasn't smiling anymore. The doll sat on the porch like it had been waiting for me. Its cracked face gleamed faintly in the morning light, and its lifeless eyes seemed to follow me as I stood frozen in the doorway. The smile that once haunted me was gone, replaced by an expression that felt angry. No, not angry. Vindictive. I tightened my grip on the hammer, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a joke. The doll, whatever it was toying with me. And it wanted something. What exactly, I didn't know, but I wasn't about to let it win. I stepped out onto the porch, my movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound firm. The doll, of course, didn't answer. It just sat there, unmoving, its glassy eyes fixed on me. I raised the hammer. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, though the quiver in my voice told a different story. "Do you hear me? I'm not afraid." The words barely left my mouth when the air around me shifted. It was subtle at first, like the faint hum of electricity, but it quickly grew into something oppressive. The morning sunlight dimmed, the world around me taking on a muted, dreamlike quality. It was as if the house and the street beyond were being swallowed by some unseen force. And then, the voice returned. "Play with me." It was faint at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder with each repetition, overlapping into a cacophony of childlike giggles and sinister murmurs. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. I swung the hammer down with all my strength, smashing the doll into the porch. Its porcelain face shattered on impact, shards flying in every direction. The voice stopped instantly, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the pieces began to move. The shattered fragments of the doll's face twitched and slid across the porch, drawn together by some invisible force. They clicked into place one by one, like pieces of a puzzle, until the doll was whole again. Its head snapped up, and the faint red glow I'd seen in the basement returned, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Play with me," it said, its voice no longer soft or childlike. This time, it was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't just a haunted object. It was something else entirely, something far worse. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Destroying the doll hadn't worked. Running hadn't worked. What else was left? The lights in the house flickered, and the temperature dropped. Frost crept across the windows, spiderwebbing out like cracks in glass. The voice echoed through the house, growing louder and more distorted. You can't run. You can't hide. My breathing was ragged as I backed into the living room. I needed to end this, whatever this was. My eyes fell on the fireplace. The flames had long since died out, but the embers still glowed faintly. Fire. Maybe that was the answer. If smashing the doll didn't work, maybe I could burn it. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid from under the kitchen sink and ran back to the porch. The doll was gone. My stomach sank. Where was it? My eyes darted around the yard, scanning for any sign of movement. The morning light was brighter now, but it didn't make me feel any safer. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps coming from behind me. I spun around just in time to see the doll standing in the doorway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move like before. This time, it sprinted toward me, its tiny porcelain legs moving with an almost insect-like speed. I panicked, spraying the lighter fluid in its direction and fumbling for the matches in my pocket. The doll reached me just as I struck the match, its tiny hands clawing at my jeans. I dropped the match onto the doll, and flames erupted instantly, engulfing it in a fiery blaze. The doll screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that echoed through the air and seemed to vibrate in my bones. The flames licked at its porcelain skin, blackening it as it thrashed and writhed on the ground. The red glow in its eyes flickered and dimmed until, finally, it went out. The wailing stopped. The air around me shifted again, the oppressive heaviness lifting as quickly as it had come. The sunlight returned to its normal brightness, and the frost on the windows melted away. For the first time in what felt like hours, the world was still. I stared at the smoldering remains of the doll, half expecting it to reassemble itself once more. But it didn't move. The porcelain was reduced to ash, its once eerie form now nothing more than a pile of charred fragments. I dropped to my knees, the adrenaline leaving my body all at once. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It was over. It had to be over. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after that. Even now, weeks later, I still feel like I'm being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow, sends my heart racing. I got rid of the house, sold it to the first buyer who came along without a second thought. I didn't tell them about the doll. I didn't tell anyone, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the voice. It's faint, almost a whisper, but it's there. Play with me. And in those moments, I wonder if it's really over, or if it ever will be.